Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Arana Shapiro, Chief Operating and Programs Officer at Games for Change, and I'm excited to introduce Kate Edwards, CEO of Geography, as well as CXO and co-founder of film tourism app Set Jetters. With over 30 years of experience helping creators navigate complex issues around the global release of their games, Kate offers unique perspective on the crucial position of games in advancing cultural change. Please join me in welcoming Kate to the stage.
Here we go. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's great to be back here. 5 years ago, I gave the keynote here at Games for Change, and I'm honored to be asked to come back to celebrate the 20th anniversary. And let's see, I don't see my slides up here. So there we go. So anyway, just for a little context, I've been around this industry for a while. I'm a geographer that does culturalization work in games, which I will dive into a bit more and explain to some degree. I also have spent time doing more advocacy work in the industry, running the International Game Developers Association, and also the Global Game Jam, which is the world's largest game creation event that happens every January or so. And so there's a lot of changes that have been going on. I mean, like when I was here last time, right immediately after speaking on the stage, I headed off to Iran to speak at the Tehran Game Festival. But of course, the world changes quite a bit. I would not repeat that trip at this moment. Things of the political climate's a little bit more difficult. But there's a lot of changes that have been going on in the world. So what's happened since Games for Change came into being 20 years ago? Well, 4 countries that exist now did not exist back then, so the map keeps changing constantly. The EU was a heck of a lot smaller back then compared to now. George W. was reelected here in this country. We had also concerns about 4G mobile were being expressed. We all know what that's like when we hear about new tech coming on the horizon. It's going to do certain things. Walmart was the #1 company in the world. And Apple was way down at 301 on the list of biggest companies in the world. How things have changed. Shrek 2 was the dominant film in the box office in 2004. And in the games world, of course, we had GTA San Andreas, Pokemon, FIFA, and Halo 2 were the top games in that year. And speaking of Halo 2, that was one of the games I worked on when I was still at Microsoft back in those days, because I left Microsoft in 2005. And I was dealing with the aftermath of this issue. And what is this issue? Well, this issue is a character named the Arbiter, who was originally named the Dervish before the game was released. Dervish is a title from Sufi Islam. And I felt that was an inappropriate title to be using in the game. And the problem is that not just the title itself, but this character served one of the 3 prophets who ran this alien group called the Covenant, which is a quasi-religious organization within the games world. One of the 3 prophets is called the Prophet of Truth, often used synonym for Muhammad. So I felt that having a dervish serve the Prophet of Truth was potentially problematic. Not only that, but we had a American-voiced super soldier named Master Chief whose mission was to stop the Covenant from doing what? Basically turning on these Halo devices and killing all sentient life in the galaxy. Also, this was the first major game we were releasing after 9/11. So we had to think about, do we really want that allegory to be supported in our game? And it opened up a huge conversation about the values that we have as creators. Is this who we want to be known for? Do we want to be known for pushing this kind of allegory? Because as I tested this allegory among several friends, especially my Muslim friends, what do you see here? And they say, well, I see a revenge fantasy being pushed forward in a science fiction game by Microsoft as a result of 9/11. And that's exactly what I basically felt as well. And so it was part of that era back when we were starting to see a bit of a shift where companies were starting to kind of embrace the idea that their values matter, but how do those basically manifest themselves in the games you work on? So as Games for Change is now celebrating its 20th year, in existence, I'm also celebrating this year my 30th year in the game industry. And over my 30 years in the industry, I've worked currently on 267 games over that time. Most of them are large AAA games, but there's a lot of other indie and other stuff smattered in there. And in that work that I've been doing all this time, both partially at Microsoft and then beyond Microsoft, is exploring this interaction between what is real, which is the geography part outside these walls, what is represented, so what we build in the game worlds and what we show there, and then most importantly to me is what is perceived. How do people perceive that game world and our intentions within that game world and everything that we're putting in there? So just to give you a little bit quick insight on what culturalization involves, typically what I do is when I work directly with game developers who are building these phenomenal game worlds. And what I'm doing is seeing how is the game worlds and all the information and expectations and intentionality being put into the game world, how is it going to be compatible with the local worldviews and with the values in those cultures to which we want to sell this game. And so it's often this process where we're looking at this zone of compatibility and incompatibility of content assets and whether or not they're going to work in a certain market. Now, this is what culturalization at its core is. What I call it at the outcome, you could call it culturalized content. I like to call it globally inclusive content. So inclusivity, yes, but not just from a strict like gender, racial perspective. I'm talking the broadest form of inclusivity, culture, politics, all these other things that we have to think about that make up who we are as human beings and who we interact with when we're pushing our game content out to the world. So, but when we make these decisions, so say for example, we're looking at a character design, it's not a matter of just looking at it and saying yes or no. It's not that simple. It's a very complex set of decisions we have to make. For example, what's your values and goals? Not only as a company, but also as an individual creator within a company or within their own organization. We'll come back to values, don't worry. The context in which content is generated, that's very important too. What I'm acknowledging here is that all of us are biased, whether we like it or not. We come from a specific culture, specific language, etc. But most of us, we overcome that bias with education. That's why we spend so much time in school, so that we can try and understand what it's like to see things from other perspectives in the world. But during the creative process, oftentimes those innate biases will creep into the process, which is why we often see, for example, the use of stereotypes in games. It's often not because it's malicious or intended to be malicious, it's because the person creating the character or whatever, they just don't know. So their brain fills in what they think they know, which is oftentimes only a shadow of the truth in terms of that particular culture. Also the business strategy for a vertical. If you're Microsoft or Sony, then games are not the only thing you make. So you have to think about how does this decision impact other things. The market strategy for the locale, like China, because it's very different selling a game in China versus Saudi Arabia versus Brazil. Market strategy for a specific game, like World of Warcraft. And also the changing geopolitical, cultural, and legal and ethical factors. Because if the one thing that the last few years have taught us is that the world's a very, very dynamic place. It changes very quickly. And so, for example, if you're Blizzard and you were dealing with your Hearthstone tournament a few years ago, you suddenly realize that, oh, there's protests going on in Hong Kong, and the winner of our tournament happened to post some pro-Hong Kong tweets and information, and then what do? They pull the prize from him. They basically demote him, say you didn't win the tournament now because you're not supposed to use political speech. And so they got into a big row about this, and it became a big public issue. But what's interesting about this is that, well, there's a lot of things where, like the CEO of Blizzard at the time said, well, there's nothing political about this. It has nothing to do with China. It's like, really, who owns a percentage of Activision Blizzard at the time? But what's interesting to me is that when you look at go to the Blizzard website and you look at what are the values, and if you've ever been to their headquarters in Southern California, there's the giant orc statue, and on the base of the orc statue, these values are emblazoned in metal on the ground. And two of the key values is that every voice matters, think globally. So to me, they kind of shat on those two values directly by the response to what they did with the Hearthstone tournament winner. And at the headquarters, a lot of the employees were putting notes of disgust on those values around the orc statue because they too were upset that their own company basically crossed the line and violated what they say they stand for. And so this matters. We notice these things today, and it's becoming more and more noticeable. And it's not like there's no news coming out of the region that Blizzard executives could have seen. There's always news coming out of the region, like, for example, what's going on with Taiwan or Hong Kong or anywhere else. All you have to do is kind of open your mind a little bit and see what is happening out there in the world. And a lot of companies today still struggle with that. And I mean companies mainly from the entertainment side of the industry. Even things like this. This issue happened fairly recently where the 9-dash line was shown on a map in this film. It was a 2-second scene in the animated film Abominable. Now, a few years ago, most companies would gladly take the scene out in order to sell this movie into the markets, because the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam said, we are not releasing this film because that representation is China's preferred representation of a very complex dispute in the South China Sea. And so they said, take the scene out and we'll be glad to distribute the film. Well, they didn't. Why did they not do it? Well, because DreamWorks partnered with a Chinese animation studio, and the Chinese animation studio said, that's not coming out. That's part of the film. And so if they don't want to see it, then forget it. We're not going to release it in those markets, and they did not. And you may have heard that just last week, same thing happened with the Barbie movie. It also happened with the Uncharted movie, because they were bending over backwards to appeal to a certain worldview, and that got them in trouble. And we see this kind of stuff in games all the time. This whole issue about whether or not games are a platform for politics, or we hear the often echo of that famous line from Ubisoft a few years ago where they said, our games are not political. It's like, really, all games have a political dimension. All games have a cultural dimension, as we will see. So what we're really talking about here is what I call this battle for mind share. It's like I see it every single day in my work. It often starts with a single issue, talking about a character design, talking about a symbol, talking about a gesture, anything like that. So it's a very specific issue in the world building process, and eventually it blossoms into a much broader discussions about the values that we have as creators and how that's going to be represented in our game. And so we're facing this battle for mind share about over who competes and controls the narrative around different cultural and issues, global issues, etc. And in response to that, creators have to decide what lines will we cross or not cross, and on what values are you basing that decision? And this dynamic has come to the forefront in the last several years of my work. It's definitely in the last 5 to 10 years. The previous 20 years, frankly, a lot of game development companies just said, whatever, just put it out there. We don't care. I shouldn't be that brash. Well, no, I should. Some of them did say that. Anyway, so I want to talk then about a few moments of punctuated change that I've seen in this industry, where I think the industry responded in a positive way as they went through and dealt with the aftermath of these issues. So these 3 issues are 9/11, Black Lives Matter, and the invasion of Ukraine. Now, some people may wonder, like, why perhaps did I not put Gamergate on this list of one of those punctuated moments of change in the industry? That's why. So you can think about that one. Yeah, nothing happened. Anyway, 9/11. So I was working at Microsoft at the time, and so the initial response to 9/11 is like, what do we do with the Twin Towers? Like in Project Gotham Racing, we had the towers already in the game. The game was on the verge of launching. Is it tacky? Is it disrespectful? And we felt, yes, we need to take them out. But because of the production schedule, we could not take them out of Project Gotham Racing. So instead, we opted to put a very nicely wordsmithed statement, a memorial statement at the beginning of the game when you launch the game. Now in Flight Sim, obviously we're like, they're out. Doesn't matter if the game's delayed or not. They have to be removed from Flight Simulator, and they were. But then other games had to deal with it too. But this isn't the real reaction to 9/11. That was just the knee-jerk about what do we do in the moment on that day and in the few days afterwards. What was really more interesting, and I think the more impactful thing, is that how the industry responded to Muslim representation in our games, and how it was an evolving issue about now we have to step back and think about what are we doing wrong with Muslim representation in our games? What do we need to do better about representation? And we saw over the subsequent years since this incident a lot of positive examples of having better Muslim representation games. I'm not saying it's perfect. In fact, none of the examples I'm showing say that hey, it's all done. Absolutely not. We have a lot of work to do still, but what I've seen is a concerted effort where these moments like 9/11 had companies wake up and realize, oh, there's a whole other type of demographic that we need to think about when we're designing our characters, designing our scenarios. And I think overall I saw it as a very positive shift in the industry, even though, yes, it's still something that's reverberating. Also with Black Lives Matter, we also saw, obviously, the industry responded very openly and very clearly with George Floyd's murder 3 years ago. But I know there's a lot of us, myself included, who are asking, why this one? there were many, many, many instances where you could have responded in this way decades earlier, and yet you chose not to. The industry didn't. I mean, they could have. There was many clear examples when they could have made that value shift and decide that this is the time. This is when we need to say that this is important. But because of the cultural moment and the other factors around BLM 3 years ago, this is when they said, let's basically do something about it. And I'm saying they said, it's not like there was a big cabal where they made a decision at a giant underground council. What I'm saying is that in my individual interactions with a lot of my clients, which include many of the large companies in this industry, there were very concerted efforts where they had to step back and say, we need to do better. What can we do better? And this moment I thought was a great time for them to think about how can we improve representation. So it wasn't just initially about Black representation. What I saw after about 6 to 9 months, then it was expanding to the broader question, what about all representation? What can we do better with all the ways that we handle human representation in our games? And we've seen some really great Black characters, for example, emerge in game narratives since that time, and some of these were already in existence. But now I see a much more concerted, focused, conscious effort to think about these things. And then the last issue is the invasion of Ukraine. This, last year caught many companies off guard. This geopolitical event where they're like, okay, well, yeah, this thing is happening over in Ukraine, because in response, like I had to spend basically the next month working with my clients as they were deciding, what do we do with the Russian content? What do we do with Ukrainian content? Do we shut down Russian servers? What do we, there's all these decisions they had to work through and think about as they were responding to this. And I can tell you that pretty much 90% of the companies I work with were caught off guard. They didn't really know what to do. They were kind of paralyzed in thinking, but because of this issue, now they are having more concentrated thoughts about policy, about how do we respond to these issues out in the world, what happens if something goes sideways in Taiwan, which we hope not. But now they're thinking about what can we do in response to these things, and how can we basically be better stewards of our game content, which players are often taking a look at. But the point here about a lot of this that we're dealing with is that content carries culture. All content carries culture. That includes games. That includes the culture of you as a creator, the culture of your company, the culture of us as an industry. It's a reflection of who we are. And that culture contains values. And so because many cultures, what defines that culture are the value sets that they have developed over the years. And those values catalyze change. The reason why we want things to change, the reason that drives us to change is the values that we have. If we have a value that we believe in justice, then we stand up and try and make justice happen. If we believe in inclusivity, then we try and make inclusivity happen. The problem with the industry that we've often seen, and the reason, the way that our values do impact our cultural influence in games, is that you actually have to embrace your values and not be afraid of them. You have to accept them and basically acknowledge the fact that any content we create as a game will contain our values. It's inherent. It's part of our culture as a company. It's part of who we are as human beings. And those values will be there whether we're conscious of it or not. So my point is, be conscious about it, because that's actually how you make change happen. So values really define how you want the world to perceive you and your work. And then as in the working place, as we are developing games, when we create policies to basically define how those values influence the creative process. And this is where we often see a bit of a disconnect, because more companies that I work with, they're understanding that their games are a cultural force, that they are an agent of change, that they can actually promote ideals within their game. Yet there's always kind of this disconnect to some degree between the stated values, like you'll see on the website, and their creative intent and the fiscal goals. And it's just this constant battle between, we want to make money, but we also have this cool game idea that we want to put out there to the world. But then how do your values intersect with that? So, are your values more, when the content goes out there and the tactics you're using to promote the game, is it more about just making money? So is that what people are going to perceive as your values? Or are they going to perceive that you're actually trying to, forward the idea of inclusivity in game representation, for example? And so a lot of the arguments that I often hear from people is like, well, I have freedom of creativity. I should be able to make anything I want. Totally agree. Games are a creative art form as valid as any other form of creative media ever created. And we need to embrace that to be a mature industry. But we also have to remember that our creative vision, while following it is critical, that vision will not always align with expectations in other cultures. And so basically, we have to constantly be mindful of the fact that our values and our culture and what we're representing in our game needs to be aligned some way with the games that we are creating. So it's constantly this issue where we're dealing with what I call the fulcrum of compromise, where games want to do two things: maximize expression, which is the artistic self-expression, which a game is, and then maximize exposure, which is get as many places around the world as possible to do what? Well, to share the vision of our great game idea, but also make money. Let's face it, the more places you go, the more money you make. And so there's different versions that you create. Like the default version is kind of your untouched, non-localized, non-culturalized version. That's your pure creative vision that you put out there to the world. That's what we tend to see in the indie space, where it's maximizing their self-expression. Whereas the more we modify the content, localize and culturalize it, the more we're actually striving to maximize exposure. And that also tends to be maximizing the revenue, because the more places you go, the more opportunity for revenue that you have. So as I conclude, I want to say to game creators, essentially, that any perceived boundary between the real world events and your game worlds is a complete illusion today. And the reason for that is because social media, love it or hate it, is part of that mechanism in our world today that holds companies accountable for the values they say they have. And so you will often see people calling them out and saying, hey, you have on your website, you say you stand for inclusivity, you say you stand for this, and you don't represent that in your game content. And that dynamic has become very real for many companies today. And any perceived separation between your values as a creation, your values and your creation, is also a false dichotomy. You can no more separate your values from what you create and what game is put out there than you can separate your DNA from your genetic offspring. You can't do it. It's just part of what happens during the process. And so to deny or ignore the fact that your games carry that cultural influence is really, in my view, to reject the very power of the medium. And so when somebody says, like, my games are not political, or my games don't represent this or whatever, it's like, why not just admit the fact that whether you like it or not, your games may be perceived that way. So embrace the values you have. And if you want them to be shown and to be more obvious in the game, then do so. There's no shame in doing that. And to Games for Change, I would want to say that thank you for 20 years of pushing this concept that being uncompromising about it, that games can be a force for positive change. Because in my view, the mainstream, like, commercial industry has heard and seen the message. They are starting to get it. Now, some companies today, I would say, I don't know, I want to assign a percentage, but a lot of companies today do it because they know it's the right thing to do, to embrace their values and to promote these values through their game content. The other half are still, I just assigned a percentage, but the other group is basically doing it out of fear of social media. That's where we are right now. I would love to see it someday where they do it because they want to do it and they know it's essentially a better thing to do, but we're not there yet. We're still an evolving process in this world. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. I think we're done.